All right, hello and welcome back to Big Questions Lawrenceburg, a live event. We're just so glad that you are with us again tonight, or maybe you're with us for the first time, or maybe you're tuning in online for the first time, or you're coming back. We just want to thank you for being here, either in this physical location at the Lawrenceburg Church of Christ or online via the internet. We're just really thankful for you and for your inquisitive heart, wanting to find the answer to some of these questions that we have about our God and our faith and the Bible and the church and all of those things. And so, if you are just joining us for the first time, we just kind of want to tell you where we've been so you know kind of where we're going. Where we've been so far is we've been talking about some big questions that people have about the church. We asked the question, where can I go to find the right church home? Like, what are the characteristics of the right church? Like, how do I know if I'm at the right church? We talked about questions like, how do I go about being saved? Like, how do I get saved? And then we've asked questions like, what is heaven going to be like? Because I think we all wonder that question. What is heaven really going to be like? Tonight we're going to ask a question that I think is close to a lot of people's hearts. It's close to my heart. We've all been through things or know people that have been through things. And the question is, why do I suffer? Why do I suffer? Excited to study that from God's Word. I know it's going to be a really emotional experience, but also it's going to be a really helpful experience studying the Scriptures about human suffering and God's role in all of that. Our speaker tonight is Mr. David Shaman. He has been the pulpit minister at the Mount Juliet Church of Christ for how many years now? 17 years. 17 years he's been the pulpit minister there. Great speaker, great man of God, and he's going to bring us a message from God's Word now, so I'll turn it over to him. Thank you.
Good evening. It is good to be with you here in Lawrenceburg. It's good that we have those joining us also through the live streaming. If I'm talking to you through the live streaming, come visit us in person sometime. You'll love this congregation. Very hospitable and warm and genuine congregation. We're simply trying to serve the Lord. As we think about this topic of pain and suffering, surely all of us at some time in our life have had a bad day. Maybe you had a bad week. I think about a Dear Abby column where R.D. Jones had kind of a tough week. Probably sometime before this, his wife had probably passed away, which was even tougher. But he decided to run an ad in the newspaper to get rid of her sewing machine, and it simply read this way: for sale, R.D. Jones has one sewing machine for sale. Phone 948-0707 after 7 p.m. and ask for Miss Kelly, who lives with him, cheap. Well, that kind of created some gossip in the little community that he lived in, and so he insisted that the newspaper run a correction on Tuesday, and so it read like this. Notice, we regret having aired in R.D. Jones' ad yesterday. It should have read, one sewing machine for sale, cheap. Phone 958-0707 and ask for Miss Kelly, who lives with him after 7 p.m. Well, that wasn't a lot better either, and so he insisted on another correction, and so the Wednesday paper read like this. Notice R.D. Jones has informed us that he received several annoying telephone calls because of the error we made in his classified ad yesterday. His ad stands corrected as follows. For sale, R.D. Jones has one sewing machine for sale. Cheap. Phone 948-0707 and ask for Mrs. Kelly, who, typo here, loves with him. Well, that really messed things up, and so he decided to solve this problem once and for all. And so on Thursday, the ad simply read like this. Notice, I, R.D. Jones, have no sewing machine for sale. I smashed it. Don't call 948-0707 as the telephone's been disconnected. I have not been carrying home with Mrs. Kelly. Until yesterday, she was my housekeeper, but she quit. All of us have had bad days, bad weeks. All of us will have a storm that will seem like the blackest, darkest night that we can imagine. All of us will have to deal with pain and suffering. But there is a very good question to ask in the midst of this. If there is a loving God, why would He allow us to suffer? if He is a loving, all-knowing God, why would He allow us to suffer? If you're wondering that, you're not alone. George Barna, several years ago, who he is the leading developer, if you will, of surveys of religious nature that survey the entire country. And so several years ago, he did a very in-depth survey where he simply asked this question, similar to what we've been asking this week. If you could ask God one question and know He would give you the answer, what would you ask? And so the results of the survey had the top response: why is there pain and suffering in this world? Several campaigns that I've been a part of where, just like this big questions here this week, where the lead-in question is simply, if you could ask God one question, what would your question be? Every time, the leading response as to what would be asked is something about suffering. Why would God allow me to suffer? Just before I stepped up here tonight, I received a text. It was from a woman whose father just passed away a few hours ago. And she said, I'm sure we'll get through it, but I don't know how at this moment. All of us have or will face that deep, horrible pain that we simply describe as suffering. But I'd like for you to think with me as we go into this tonight, first with a spotlight on not just why suffering, but first let's pause at that word why. Can godly people ask God why? Is it a lack of faith to ask God why? Is it a sin to ask God why? I think about several years ago, I walked in a hospital room to visit a lady who was considered a spiritual rock in the congregation. She had had years and years of illness, but yet the faithful and optimistic way that she continued to endure through hardship was a very godly example for everyone. Everyone, in one sense or another, looked up to her spiritually. She was in the hospital, and I was going by to visit her, and it perhaps was coincidence or providence. The doctor was walking out of her room as I was walking in. I had no idea what he had just said to her, but what he had said to her was that you're going to die soon. And so as I walked in the room, she was crying. And when she saw me, through her tears, she said, why? Why would God allow this to happen? Why would God allow this to happen to me? And she sobbed. And then in just a moment's time, she dried it up. She kind of sat up more proper in her hospital bed, and with a stoic look on her face, she said, please pray for me. I'm sorry. Please ask God to forgive me. I've sinned. I should have never asked God why. I didn't say a prayer for her forgiveness. Instead, I challenged her a little bit. Is it a sin to ask God why? You know the short book of Habakkuk, and if you don't, and if this topic intrigues you, you need to take some time tonight before you go to bed, and you need to read those 3 chapters, because it's all about what we're talking about here. You see, what Habakkuk just couldn't understand was why he saw suffering of the righteous people as they were being heavily oppressed by the wicked people. And you don't go but just a few verses into that book to where he's looking up toward heaven and he's asking God, why? Why are you showing me this iniquity? Why are you showing me this oppression? Job lost almost everything. He went to the funeral of 10 children. All of them his. All the children he had. He lost all the possessions he had. He lost a supporting wife. He lost his health. He lost most of his friends. And even the friends that did show up, they didn't comfort him, so he lost his comfort as well. And it was in that situation that Job said in Job the 10th chapter, in verse 2, "Show me why you contend with me." The only perfect individual that ever walked the face of this earth hung between heaven and earth. And he looked up and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Was he still perfect after he asked that question? Listen, God has no problem with you asking him questions. God's not afraid of your questions. He's not afraid that you'll stump him. He's not afraid that if you ask a question a certain way, it's going to reveal some kind of ugly side of God that he didn't want anybody to see. God knows the answer to every question you can bring him. And you can't reveal a side of God that is ungodly or wicked. God welcomes your questions. As a matter of fact, Habakkuk, when you read at the very end of the first chapter, going into the second chapter, you have to admire Habakkuk because what he did when he asked why is an example for all of us. He asked why, turning to God, and says, "I'm going to go wait upon the rampart, and I'm going to see what your answer is to correct me." Hear that humility? God, I've got a question of why, and I'm coming to you for the answer, and I want you to correct me in however wrong I am in my reasoning. Job continued to stay with God, and the way the end of the book is revealed to us is that God comes down to Job, who was still waiting on God to give an answer, and so God came down and did not answer everything that Job asked. But he did answer enough to say, "Do you trust me? Can you trust that I know what is best?" When you and I err, it's because we ask why as we're turning our back on God and we're walking away from God. But where we are right is when we ask why and we turn to God, trusting that he knows what is right and best. And in some of those things we can find the answer. What does God reveal to us? Well, let's think about this idea of why suffering. I'd like for you to think of the fact that some of this answer, not all of it, but some of this answer lies in the realm of the way that God chose to create us so that we would be individuals that have the opportunity to choose to have a relationship with him. We are people of choice. Within that realm of choice, we have the opportunity to have relationship. Within that realm of choice, we also have the opportunity to share in emotions. Let me give you one scenario that illustrates all three of these, although it doesn't have to be in this way. We see all three in this simple illustration. You remember back in maybe high school days or shortly after, you remember when you saw that guy or girl that you liked, but you didn't know if they liked you, and you remember the day you found out that you both liked each other, and you kind of talked to each other, and the beginning of a relationship was there, and you had that feeling inside, and you kind of said, "Whoa, this like feels better than I felt, and I don't know when." Well, what did we just illustrate here? We illustrated choice. You had a choice of whether or not you wanted to choose to talk to them, and they had a choice whether or not they wanted to choose to talk with you, and you began to form a relationship that was choice. And within that relationship came the feeling and the emotion of, wow, this is great. And then you remember when a few weeks or a few months later you got the Dear John letter? Hey, you know what? I had the opportunity to choose you, and now I have the opportunity to not choose you. And now I had the opportunity to have a relationship with you, and now I don't want a relationship with you. And you know that good, fuzzy, warm feeling you have? It's not there anymore, is it? Now you've got like the deepest heartbreak and sorrow, and it feels a lot like suffering to some degree. You see, so much of our suffering that we experience is because we are created with choice. Within that realm of choice is not only us individually, but everybody around you gets to choose. So ultimately, some of our pain comes from our choices, and some of our pain comes from other people's choices, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit later on. But I want you to notice within this realm of pain is something that is very, very important. And that is, you have the opportunity to also choose your response. A lot of people believe that A equals C. In other words, A is what happens to you, and C is your life. But that's not true. The truth is, your life is A plus B equals C, and B is your response to what happens to you. What happens to you, you get to choose how you're going to respond to it. And your response to what happens to you is your life. We can find individuals that one of them has cancer, and their response to that has created one kind of life. We can see someone else who has cancer, and their response to that has created a totally different life. We can see someone that has a loss of a loved one in their life, and their response to that is one kind of life. And we'll see someone else that also has a loss of a loved one in their life, and their response looks totally different in their life. You see, the difference lies not in the losses or the suffering. The difference lies in the response. Viktor Frankl, he was a doctor that the Nazis used in concentration camps. And what was sad in his life was that he saw a lot of people suffering. During that time, he lost his wife, a brother, and his mother. But it was also during that time that some things that he had wondered were confirmed about how is it that some people go through suffering and it seems like their life is destroyed, and other people go through suffering and it seems like that they come out stronger. And so he became keenly aware of what any of us that know the Scriptures already knew. That is, it's not the suffering that defines us. It is the response to the suffering that defines us. This is what he says. Between stimulus, whatever happened to you, and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. I like to think about you walking through life, and some of you men will like this illustration. You're walking through life and it's like you always, at all time, have a remote control in your hand. How cool is that? And it's like you never lay the remote down. And the remote controls your life, and something happens to you, and if you're wise, you press the pause button. You say, let me step out of this for just a moment, and let me choose what would be a godly response. God, by nature, here's how I want to react to this suffering. Someone's gossiped about me. They stabbed me in the back. Someone has stolen something from me. A doctor's giving me news I don't want. My employer gave me the pink slip. We can go on and on and on. Lord, this has happened, but instead of me just reacting to it and saying, well, that's just my life now, let me press the pause button, and instead of this being horizontal, let me go vertical here. Lord, what do you want me to do in this situation? How will you strengthen me in this situation? And as we'll discuss tomorrow night, how can I go through this situation and fulfill the purpose for which you have created me? You see, then, when we learn and gain our wisdom from God, we can then press on our remote the play button. And now we can respond so that we will have a life that is much, much different than what it would have otherwise been, because we have chosen a B that is of God. As we think about this, I would like for you to also think about in just the last few minutes that we have for this last part of this lesson. I'd like for you to think not only the fact that God made us free will, and within that there's a lot of things that are going to be chosen by us or by others, and even our response is chosen. But for just a few minutes, I'd like for you to think about a second aspect of why we suffer. We suffer because we live in temporary houses right now. Your body is not designed to live forever. And if I might be so bold and blunt to even say, you're not an exception. You are going to get sick. As a matter of fact, one of these days, you're going to get so sick, you will die. Unless you have a tragic accident and you die of an accident instead of a disease or sickness. I know somebody's saying, wow, he just got rude and blunt. I'm just trying to help you with your being. It's interesting how many people respond to the idea of facing death as, why me? And I don't mean to be rude, but I just want to be like, are you kidding me? Do you know anybody 125 years old? There are over 7 billion people on this earth. You don't know anybody 125 years old. Every person lives in a temporary body. Now, does that mean we need to become cold and calloused and when someone's sick to say, hey, we're not worried about you being sick, you're in a temporary body? No. But it does mean that we need to be wise in understanding that this earth has never meant to be our eternal home, and this body has never been intended to be an eternal body, an immortal body. When Paul looked at perhaps slightly to the idea of aging, but probably for Paul it was more to the idea of injury that came because of his faith through persecution. Remember, he would end up dying as a martyr. And so just through all of this idea of suffering, he looked at the reality and he says, we know this. And so I'm asking myself this, and I'm asking you here tonight. Do you believe God and do you know it? Okay, what is it we need to know? Paul said we know it. We know that our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed. We have a building from God. That's talking about our next body that we're going to receive. And it's a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. But what about while we're on this earth in this temporary body? In this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with habitation which is from heaven. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. He continues in verse 4 by again saying, for we who are in this tent groan. What's the point? I want you to imagine a nice, large, beautiful brick home. And I want you to imagine beside that brick home the little Coleman tent. Now, just using our earthly language, which one's permanent and which one's temporary? Like, you know, there's probably a lot of people here that say, oh, I enjoy camping. Can you imagine writing the Coleman Corporation and saying, hey, I bought one of your nice houses to live in, and you know, it really is so little and uncomfortable. I can't believe you expect us to live in this tent for the next 50 or 60 or 70 or 80 years. If anybody answered it, my guess is that their answer would be, dear sir, dear ma'am, you realize you bought a very temporary dwelling place. We don't expect you to live in this tent for years. We expect you to go on little short camping trips and live in that tent temporarily. How are you going to accept suffering? How are you going to identify suffering? It makes all the difference. If you think that this earth is supposed to be eternal and that this body is supposed to last forever, you're going to have a very difficult time with the topic of suffering. But if you realize the great news, that there's something waiting for us that is so much better than this earth, and there's an immortal body that we're going to be given at the end of 1 Corinthians 15 chapter, it describes it, and that on the resurrection we're going to be given a body. Revelation 21st chapter tells us that it's going to be a body where we'll have no more pain and sickness. You won't ever go to an emergency room again, never go through surgery again, you'll never go to a funeral again, never need Kleenex again. It'll be an amazing, amazing time. But on this earth, there's going to be suffering. And so then that leads to this. How are you going to respond to that suffering? How are you going to respond to the reality that you live in a temporary body? Did you know that Old and New Testament speak a whole lot about that? We don't have time to speak a whole lot about it, but I want to show you a couple of verses. If you want to study these a lot deeper on your own, there is a lot to gain from these simple teachings right here. Psalm 90, just going directly to verse 12, he says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." And what does he mean by teach us to number our days? Is he saying that we ought to become prophetic and we ought to be able to say, oh, you're going to live 3,000 more days, and you're going to live 200 more days, and you're going to live 560 more days? Like, what does he mean by that? No, he's saying number them, realizing that each one has great value and that there is an end. In other words, if you go out with a stack of cash and go shopping, and you go out with a credit card and go shopping, statistically, you will spend a lot more money with a credit card. Why? Because you see your cash going down, and as your cash starts leaving your hands, you say to yourself, wow, I need to be more wise with what I have. I'm about to run out of money here. But yet someone with a credit card just spends $1 and doesn't even realize it's spent. Like some people spend a day, and they don't even think about the fact, oh, it's spent. Like, you would agree, right, that every one of us were one day closer to death than what we were yesterday. Every one of us. So your life, for certain, is one day shorter right now than it was the day ago. You'll have one less day. Right now, compared to 7 days ago, you have one less week. So how did you spend your week? How did you spend your day? Was what you did today worth a day of your life? Well, that's why the wise take it to heart. Say, wow, you know, I really ought to use my life in a way that is wise and best. And again, tomorrow we'll talk more about that purpose. And that's so important. This is how the New Testament says it in Ephesians, the 5th chapter. In verse 15, 16, 17, he says, so then you ought to walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise. There's a big difference in how we walk. The wise are going to do what? Redeeming the time. See value in every day and use it how it should. Why? Because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but what? Understand what the will of the Lord is. And so when we read in Galatians, the 6th chapter, verse 7, we see that whatever man sows, that shall he also reap. So sometimes the suffering that we experience in our life is because we've made bad decisions and we're reaping the consequences of it. But by no means is that all the suffering in our life. By no means is that all the suffering. Sometimes we receive suffering because sowing and reaping, you always sow one seed, but it reaps a broader harvest. Like you sow one kernel of corn and it reaps a whole stalk and several ears and hundreds of kernels of corn. Well, when someone around us sows seeds that are sinful and bad, the harvest spills over on other people. And so if we have family members that are continually sinning, we're going to reap some suffering because of that. If we have sin in our own life, we're going to reap some suffering because of that. It's just the law of sowing and reaping. And so here we are on earth that is flawed, it's sinful, and there's going to be a lot of suffering because of sowing and reaping. And then, as we've already said, there's a lot of suffering because of the temporal nature of this earth. This earth is not our permanent home, but you know what it is? As we close this, I want you to think about this simple statement, but the more I've studied this topic, the more I appreciate and value this fact. As flawed and painful as this earth is, which is a really good reason to love the thought of heaven, but as flawed and as painful as this earth is, it is a really good place to grow spiritually. God makes sure of that. This room is full of individuals that have lived on this earth and have grown very strong spiritually. We can look back through the Holy Scripture and we can see a lot of people that went through immense suffering and yet they grew so strong spiritually. And so it is a beautiful thought that in the midst of the suffering, it cannot harm, but really only fuel the strong relationship that we can have with God. And that's the way He designed it. So will God allow you to suffer? A loving God? Absolutely. Because it's through suffering that we grow.
All right, so we're just going to jump right into the Q&A over here as soon as David gets papers all in order there. And I told Philip yesterday, now you're on the hot seat. So
I feel it.
Get prepared. Just mentally get ready. We're just going to go ahead and get started. I want to say this one more time. If you have questions, you just continue to text those, and we'll try to get to them all tonight. If we can't, we'll try to maybe get some responses back to you. But hopefully we'll be able to answer as many as we can tonight, and that'll be beneficial. Okay, first question I have for you here. The person says, my child passed away when he was just a small boy. People keep telling me it was God's will. Is it really God's will that my son was taken from me?
First, let's identify the fact that this is a very difficult question in the sense of the pain that is associated with the question. Professionals almost always agree that either the first or second greatest grief to deal with is the loss of a child. And so whoever asked that question has gone through and continues to go through, and probably as long as they live, will go through a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. The second thing let's point out about this question is that it identifies the fact that for some reason we have grown very comfortable blaming God for things that God doesn't do. I'll be honest with you, I'm surprised sometimes the things that people say that God did. And, you know, I bite my tongue and I try to handle it right, but I really want to get sarcastic. And I just really want to say, really? You think God did that? What does God identify death as in 1 Corinthians 15? God said it's the enemy. I believe it's verse 26. As a matter of fact, to God, death is such a horrible enemy that if I understand 1 Corinthians 15 there, when Jesus comes back again, he's going to start knocking off the enemies. And he's going to save one back for the very end. And God says in 1 Corinthians 15, I'm saving death back. And the last enemy that I destroy is death. I can assure you God didn't take the child. That an enemy took the child. And now, the hope, the great hope, is to join King David in his understanding of God and of eternity. And really, we have to accept this earth is very short. This earth is temporary. Even though when you're going through suffering like that, it seems like the days are long and the nights are longer. But this is short. You know, this is our short home. We've got this eternal home that's way out in front of us. And David looked at this short home, and while his son was alive, he prayed and he fasted. And after the son died, his little baby, after the baby died, he got up and he cleaned up and kind of confused the servants. And so they were bold enough to finally ask him. At first they were afraid to address him, but afterwards they kind of asked him and said, you know, this looks kind of backwards to us. And his response was, look, while my son was sick, I was still praying that God would do something. But now that he is dead, he will not come back to me, but I will go to him. And that needs to be our hope in that situation. And just within the last 2 days, somebody told me, said, when my loved one was a wife, so when it was a husband saying this, and when my wife passed away, I had so many brethren tell me that God took her. And he said, it was all I could do not hit me. And he said, I really had a low time for several weeks and months because people were confusing me about my God. I want to encourage you. Pain is one of the number one things that we deal with that discourages us and even turns people away in faith. If you have not become a student of how to comfort other people in pain, you're going to do a lot of damage, and you're going to miss a lot of opportunities to encourage people. The first story that we know of in detail about pain and suffering is the book of Job. And what? Many chapters. What, 42 chapters? And what did God do in those 42 chapters? He said, let me show you how pitiful some people are as friends. Those friends did real good when they showed up and they just had their presence for 7 days. And whenever they started talking, they ruined everything. And I think what God's trying to tell us with the first story in the Bible about suffering, I think He's also trying to tell us, hey, you might want to brush up a little bit on how to comfort other people. I'd say most of the time families have loss hear more things that are painful and harmful than helpful. I would say if you had to weigh it out 50-50, it would be more. You know, like the comments at the casket, I'd say probably 60 or 70% are much more painful than comforting. And you just want to say, why? Why don't we take the time to learn the truth about this topic and to learn the truth about comfort? So I just want to encourage you, if you've never studied it and dealt with it, trying to seek wisdom in this, it's really worth it because there's a lot of people that need it.
Sometimes the best thing to do is not to say anything, just be there. You know, that's great point. Hey, this question is somewhat similar, but this person says, I know God is with me, and I don't want my suffering to disappear, but is there a passage that I might turn to help me endure the heartbreak and pain of suffering a little bit easier?
Yeah, there are several. Let me grab my glasses. And if you want me to turn to 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians, let's go to 2 Corinthians 12. And my mind was thinking Romans 5 is another good one. If you're jotting them down, Romans 5, 1 through 5 is a good passage. James 1 through 3 or 4. You could go down to verse 5 there. Would be a great one to see that we should have joy in the trials because it gives us the opportunity to persevere. Romans 8 and 28 is awesome in that setting. But let's think for just a moment. If I had to single one out that to me is just a huge encouragement, would be 2 Corinthians 12. As I'm turning there, don't take for granted the one that oftentimes is a huge go-to, and that is Psalm 23. That's huge. Another one that I think is so beneficial is the whole chapter of Psalm 46. It's not a long chapter, but the whole chapter of Psalm 46 is very rich in that. But notice here in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul had the thorn in the flesh that was creating some kind of huge disturbance in his life. And so he prayed 3 times for God to remove that from him. But what we have insight in the first paragraph of 2 Corinthians 12 was that he also had some opportunities to see into the third heaven that nobody had ever had the opportunity to see, and nobody was allowed. He wasn't allowed to talk about it. And so what is said here in verse 7 is that God knew that Paul could have very easily become arrogant about this and fallen away. And so where did this pain and suffering come from? Look at verse 7. It was a messenger of Satan to buffet me. So notice, God didn't bring this thorn into his life, but Satan did. But when he prayed to God and said, will you remove it? There would have been times in Scripture that God would have removed the thorn. But for Paul, in this particular time in his life, he said, you know what? I'm not going to remove it this time. But I will give you the strength to endure through it, because he knew it would keep him humble and it would keep him safe. And so he says in verse 9, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I would rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And so that's powerful to think that God works through suffering that sometimes Satan creates. God will work through the suffering to allow us to grow stronger and to keep us on track. If I say this, would it paint the wrong picture to any of us about God? I hope it doesn't. But are you mature enough spiritually to hear and understand this fact? God would rather us suffer on this earth for our soul to be secured for eternity. And so if we need some suffering in our life in order for us to grow spiritually, God is such a loving Father that He's going to do what is best for us, not what is most comfortable for us.
Yeah, great point, great point. This is a little bit taken from a different angle here. This person says, religious people in various churches have been the source of a lot of pain in my life. It's hard for my heart to feel close to God when I feel like His people don't necessarily want me. What can I do? What should I do? Need some advice there.
Yeah, and that's a sad situation and probably felt by a lot of people. Rejection is hard. Rejection is real. It's painful. It's deep. And anything that we lose, we want acceptance. When we lose acceptance, anything we lose, we experience grief. And so the sadness and the grief and the suffering of knowing I haven't been accepted by my family, or I talked with a woman today. A lot of her grief in her life was that she's not accepted by her family. When we're not accepted by the Lord's family, there's a lot of grief in that. And let me throw out this as kind of maybe one of the first broad statements. And then, of course, if the individual wants to sit down and talk more, we would love to have the opportunity in a private setting to really kind of get into some of the details that might surround it. But let me just say this as a kind of a broader, important principle to keep in our mind, and that is God and His plan is perfect. His people are flawed. So we're always, to some extent, going to let each other down. But what we can't do, even when people that are supposed to be God's people hurt us, we have to see the difference in the people and God. And know that God is just as disappointed with the people that hurt this person as this person is disappointed. And so, let's not ever give up on God because of what people do. And I know that's a lot easier to say than when you're in the midst of that pain, but still, the truth is the truth. And so in the midst of the pain, that's still the truth.
Yes, thank you. Hey, great job, brother. We don't have much more time, so we're going to wrap up here. But if you still have questions, once again, if you're watching on Periscope, you can actually slide over and see the phone number that you can text is right there. And we've got the number was on the board. We can put it back on the board. Or if you're here and you have questions, I think there are actually some note cards that you can turn in some questions to. Whatever we can do to help you, we want to help you. We hope that tonight has been a beneficial night for you, and that you've really been touched by God's Word and have been able to look into your heart and kind of address or begin to address some of the hurt and pain in your life. There's so much sorrow in the world. We don't have to turn on the news very long to see. There's so much sorrow in the world, but thankfully we serve a God that's promised in Hebrews 13. He's not going to leave us. He's not going to forsake us. We need only follow after Him. Just want to thank you again for tuning in. Be sure to come next week, tomorrow, at 7 o'clock, when we'll address our last question and hopefully close out this series on a good note and address one more question that you might have. I wish to appreciate it, and hope you have a good night.